Hey guys, this video, which is gonna be pretty freaking awesome, is pretty much a complete guide to recording metal rhythm guitars for the full mix and using a real amp, not an amp sim. Now, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with amp sims, but let's be honest, there's just something like magical and unicornish about recording with a real live tube amp. Now, there are 5 sections to this video, and some of the stuff we're going to talk about may be preliminary. So if you're, let's say, a seasoned guitarist, no, not that type of seasoned. Anyway, what I meant, if you're experienced in recording your guitars already, you might want to skip section 1. So on that note, no pun intended, I've got timestamps for you for each section in the YouTube description of this video. So feel free to go there and click on the part that you want to learn about the most, or just sit back and enjoy the whole video. Alright, the first section, we're going to talk about the gear and the equipment that you need to do this in the first place. Now, this is the basic preliminary stuff we're going to cover here. However, even if you are an experienced guitarist, yes, you know all this stuff, but you might want to hang around anyway because I'm going to share all the gear that I'm using, and hey, that's the stuff that we love to talk about. In no particular order because you need all the stuff to record your guitar amp. Let's start out with the DAW. This is your digital audio workstation, aka your recording software. This is where you're capturing everything in. Now, I'm using PreSonus Studio One. And don't get caught up in trying to get the best DAW or this DAW versus that DAW or whatever, because it really doesn't matter at the end of the day. They're kind of relatively the same, especially when you're just recording your rhythm guitar tracks. I mean, you just need something to pick up that signal that you're about to record. The next thing, you need an audio interface. Now, for you newbies, that's the little device that you plug your guitar into, or in this case, we're actually going to be plugging a mic into it. Remember, we're recording a real amp. And then you're going to connect the interface to your computer, and that's how we're transmitting that signal to your software. Now, let's talk about the amp and the additional little components that you might need to go with that amp. So again, I'm going to share exactly what I'm using, which is the EVH 5153 tube amp. And this has the EL34 tubes. I almost bought the one with the 6L6 tubes because that was the first one that I played the first time I played an EVH amp. But then I had a buddy that had the EL34 tube version. I played through that and I'm like, I think I like this one better. It's not really relevant to this video. I just thought I would share that with you because, you know, we like to talk about guitars and amps. Now, the first thing you're going to need, and this is for any metal tone, you're going to want to stick a noise gate in front of that amp. And in this case, I'm using an MXR Smart Gate. And of course, you're going to want a noise gate whether you're recording your amp or you're playing live. And I know this is a very basic step, but guys, the last thing I want you to do is to walk into the studio and set everything up and be like, oh crap, dude, I forgot my noise gate. You're hearing that, you know, that annoying hum. Now, the other thing you may or may not need, depending on the amp you have or the type of tone that you're going for, is an overdrive pedal. Some of the classic amps that are known for producing metal guitar tones, they need that overdrive pedal just to clean and tighten up the tone a little bit. However, this amp I'm using does not need it. In fact, I have tried this with different overdrive pedals and it actually takes away from the tone that I want. I actually get a really nice tight tone with just the amp distortion. And I know there's other more modern amps that will give you that as well. That doesn't mean you should use that type of amp. Use whatever amp you want. Use whatever amp that you get the best tone out of. My point here is just realize what you need to go with it to get the tone that you want, because again, we're recording these tones for the full mix. Now, I've got this amp running through a 212 cabinet, and actually it's the matching cabinet that goes with this EVH, this particular EVH amp. Many of you though would prefer to use a 412 cabinet, and that's okay too. My advice is whatever you have right now, just use that, because if you have a good amp and your performance is good, I'm not sure if it matters so much about the cabinet. Yeah, it matters a little bit, but for the most part, you're still gonna get a really nice tone, especially after going through this video, because I'm gonna show you how to do that. The last piece of equipment you need here is a microphone. Now, I'm gonna get a little bit more into the mic and mic placement. That's coming up in section 3. Oh, and the last piece of gear, and I'm just doing this for the sake of sharing gear here, is the guitar. You do need your guitar. This is the ESP E2 Horizon FR7. That's what we're using for this video. Section number 2. We're now going to dig into the amp settings, and particularly the gain and the bass. Now, this is a very simple section. It's going to be kind of quick, but it's extremely important. The one thing you have to remember when you're dialing in your amp tone for the full mix, you're recording your song, you're recording the album, is your tone for the full mix is probably going to be a little bit different from your bedroom tone, your jamming tone. You see, us guitar players, we like a lot of gain. It just sounds cool. And we also like bottom end. The thing about having too much gain in the full mix is it's gonna make the mix sound muddy. And having too much bottom end, well, then you're gonna be competing with other frequencies that other instruments are supposed to produce, not your guitar. So those frequencies are gonna clash, and it's gonna make your mix even more muddy. We don't want that in the full mix. So I'm gonna go through my EQ settings, and I'm also gonna let you hear what this sounds like just as a single track. Now, you will get to hear the full mix later in the video as well, so make sure you keep watching. Let's take a look at the settings I have here, and this is what's worked for me. I'm not saying these exact settings will work for you, but you can at least use them as a guide and then make some tweaks on your own and just see what sounds best for you. First, let's start with the gain. You'll see that my gain is right there in between 6 and 7. I know a lot of people love to crank that gain up. Now, it may not sound muddy when you're playing it, but once you put it in the full mix, then you might not like what you hear. So I'm trying to save you that hassle and frustration of having to go back and re-record your guitar tracks. So what I recommend is just playing around with the gain setting. Try to play with the lowest gain you possibly can, while still getting that distortion and that saturation that you're looking for. And again, a good place to start with gain is between 6 and 7 there. Now let's move on to the bass setting. As you can see, my bass setting is cut just a little below 5 there. And this is where a lot of guitar players face problems. When they're playing their guitar, they're like, man, it just doesn't sound meaty and chunky enough. So they're gonna naturally boost the bass. Remember though, the bottom end in your music, in the full mix, save that for the bass guitar and the kick drum and any other lower end frequencies that should be produced by other instruments, not your guitar. And again, it goes back to your recorded tone for the full mix is going to be a little bit different than what you're used to playing to when you're jamming by yourself. Now, I'm going to go through the rest of the settings really quick here, but to be honest, guys, the rest of these settings are kind of like personal preference. I'm going to share mine anyway. Now, I'm an old school metal guy, or an old school metal tone guy, so I like that cut in the mids. It's just my preference, and you can see my mids are set somewhere between like 3 and 4 here. I know some of you like to play with a little bit more mids. If you're more into the modern metal and the gent kind of thing, I think you got to boost the mids for that a little bit. So to each their own on the mids. Now the treble, again, this is another personal preference thing. I like to boost my treble. You can see mine's between like 6 and 7, or right at like 6.5 there. What I will say though is you probably don't want to cut your treble at all, but you don't want to boost it too high either. Remember, the goal is to have your guitar tones sit well in the mix, and we want to get the best tone possible coming out of our amp, so that we don't have to do as much post-processing. Next is the presence. Again, this is a big personal preference here, and really to me, I've found that it depends on the amp I'm playing through. On this particular amp, the EVH 5153, I actually cut my presence a little bit. I'm not a big fan of the tone I get with the presence boosted. Some amps may sound better with it boosted, some not. So just play around with that and see what sounds, or hear what sounds best to your ears. So real quick, let's hear what this tone sounds like with the settings I just shared with you. Remember, the goal is to get the best tone possible before you record it because what we want to do is limit the amount of post-processing that we have to do after the fact in the studio, and we're going to get to that later as well. Section number 3, and guys, this is a really crucial part of recording your guitars and getting a really nice tone for the full mix, and that's your mic and mic placement. You really can't go wrong with the good old Shure SM57 mic, and that's what I'm using in this video. Now that doesn't mean it's the best mic for you. I think it will work just fine for you. I think you can use that mic and you will be very happy with your tone as long as you do everything else right. But there are other mics out there, of course, that you can use. And even if you're new to recording guitar with a real amp, I'm sure you've played through plugins and you'll see in your plugins, your amp sims, that you've got all these different virtual mics you can use. So yeah, there are several mics you can use. What I will say to mics is use what's in your budget, and that's gonna bring me back to the Shure SM57 because it's like 99 bucks, so it doesn't get any cheaper than that. Now, if you are going into a professional studio, I know some of you record at home, a lot of us record at home, I do, but if you happen to go into a studio that has different mic options and you have access to that, by all means, try out different microphones. Now let's talk about mic placement. Better yet, let's hear some samples of different mic placements here. So I'm gonna give you 3 sound bites here, and just to give you a heads up here, 2 of these sound bites probably won't sound very good. One of them is gonna sound pretty cool, and I'll explain why after you hear them. Alright, so the first sound bite you heard, you know, that real bright and fizzy sound bite, I had the mic right up next to the center of the cone. Now there might be some cases where you want that more for like a special effect or something, but that's probably not going to sit too well in the mix. The second sound bite, I had the mic placed far away from the cone. Now that did give you a little bit darker tone, which I personally prefer the darker tones, but it also sounded like it was in another room, and that's not quite what we want either. The third sound bite you heard was probably the best, at least in my opinion it was, and I had the mic not at the center of the cone, but not so far away from it either. It's kind of like a happy medium spot there. And there's a little circumference there that you can kind of play around with the mic placement. Just remember, the closer to the center of the cone you get, the more bright and tinny sound you're going to have. The further away, you're going to have a darker sound, but you also run the risk of it sounding like really like boomy and just off in outer space or something. Now, one thing I didn't cover is the proximity of the mic. When you're using something like the SM57, which is a dynamic mic, you want that mic pretty close to that grill. It doesn't necessarily have to be touching it. My rule of thumb is I have it about a 1/4 inch, maybe a 1/2 inch away from the grill there. If you have it too far away from the amp speaker, it's just not gonna pick up the sound that you need it to pick up, and you're gonna get more room noise. Now, if you wanna get a little bit more advanced, and a lot of guitar players like to do this, is you'll have your one mic close to the amp there, but then you might have another mic capturing some of that room sound. Now you'll have those going into 2 separate channels, but those tones combined, that can give you a really unique sound as well. Alright, in section number 4, we're actually going to record our rhythm guitar track. So I'm going to let you hear 2 sound bites for this, okay? And this is going to be in the full mix with the bass guitar and the drums. And then I'm going to tell you what the differences are between these 2 sound bites, and I'll show you how to get the most awesome sound. So that didn't sound too bad, I guess, but Let's hear soundbite number 2. Now you probably noticed that soundbite number 2 sounded a lot better and a lot more lively and organic than soundbite number 1. Soundbite number 1, I only recorded one rhythm guitar track. What I want you to do is what I did in soundbite number 2, and here's what I did. I recorded one rhythm guitar track, right? After I recorded that, I hard panned that track all the way to the left. So just go in your DAW and you can go to that specific track after you record it and just pan it all the way to the left. Now I want you to open a brand new guitar track. This is going to be for rhythm number 2. And this is where it really gets fun recording, and I'll show you why in a minute here. I want you to go ahead and pan that second track all the way to the right before you record anything. Now real quick, the reason why I record 2 rhythm tracks and hard pan each one, it just makes it more lively sounding. See, here's the thing. You play one track, then you come back and play the second track. Well, you're not going to play that second track exactly like the first track. Now, I'm not saying you should screw up and be off on your timing and all that stuff, but you're going to have some of these slight little differences that create these nuances, and that just brings your song to life. It sounds so much more awesome than just having the one track. Now, the reason I hard pan each one is because oftentimes if you have 2 tracks, 2 guitar tracks up the middle playing the same thing, it just tends to sound really muddy and it's hard to distinguish what's going on, and you're not going to capture those little nuances that you might hear otherwise. Another quick note on that, if you've got some harmonizing metal rhythm parts, you can do that with that second guitar, and that sounds really killer, especially when they're hard panned like that. Oh, and there's one more thing I forgot to mention in regards to recording your guitars. Make sure your levels aren't peaking, but also make sure they're being picked up in your studio. You're gonna have to play around with your amp volume and the volume on your interface for that channel that you have your mic plugged into. And a lot of interfaces will have like a little red light, and if you see that red light coming on, that means your levels are peaking, so you're gonna need to bring the volume down somewhere, whether it's your microphone or your amp. And also take a look at your tracks while you're recording as well. You don't want to see this. That's obviously a very weak signal, but you also don't want to see this. That means you're just blowing everything up. What you see here is, pretty good, comfortable sound wave, and you can work with that. Section number 5 is the post-processing, the post-production of our guitar tracks that we just recorded. There's 2 plugins I want to highly encourage you to use. One is going to be a compressor, 2 is going to be an EQ plugin. And they need to be in that specific order because you want that sound compressed first, then you want to add the EQ. Now here's why we need those plugins, or I shouldn't say you need them, but it's just a good practice. So what the compressor's job is to just really even out the sound. In other words, if you've got some lower parts in that guitar track, it's going to bring them up. And if you've got some parts that may be a little too high, it's going to help bring those back down. And that happens when we're playing metal guitar. When you're palm muting and doing a lot of fast alternate picking and stuff like that, sometimes your sounds that are being produced can be a little off from one another. So the compressor just helps even things out. Now the EQ is really just for one thing here, and it's to roll off the bottom end of your guitars. Now remember, we worked hard to get the best guitar tone possible going in. So in theory, there should be a lot less post-processing needed. However, metal guitars, or metal amps I should say, they still can produce a lot of bottom end and those low frequencies. So the EQ is often used to roll that off a little bit. And you can also touch up some of the other frequencies if you choose. Now, I don't recommend going crazy if you're at the point where your guitar track just does not sound good, no matter how you EQ it. You probably need to go back to the drawing board and re-record that track. But again, if you paid attention in section number 2, You really shouldn't have to do that, and that's what I'm trying to save you guys from. Now the cool thing is those two plugins, the compressor and EQ, you do not have to purchase those. Those are in your recording software. Your DAW should have a stock compressor and a stock EQ, and you don't have to use any fancy settings. For the compressor, I basically just drag in the compressor from my DAW from PreSonus Studio One, and I'll use the default setting for guitar, and boom, I don't really have to do anything else. And here's a screenshot of that. As for the EQ, same thing. I'll just pull it in from my DAW, and I'll put my screenshot for my EQ settings right here. This is what works well for me. And feel free to go back to those parts and take your own screenshot of my screenshots and then replicate that in your studio plugins. Now another little trick here, and you can do this in your studio, is instead of applying the compressor and EQ to both guitar tracks, you can actually create what's called a bus. And no, I'm not talking about the cheese wagon. That's what we called a bus back in my days. You're like, hey dude, are you driving to school today? No, I got in trouble. I've got to ride the cheese. So what this bus allows you to do is put the plugins in the bus, and you can associate your tracks to that bus, so that way those two tracks, or however many tracks you want, are using those plugins in that bus. I hope I explained that properly. So let me do this on screen for you. I am going to highlight my two guitar tracks. So highlight this guitar track, highlight that guitar track. Now in my case here, I'm just going to right click, and then you can see down here I can send to a bus. Now you see it created this extra little section over here, which is my bus. So whatever plugins, whatever effects I put in that bus, they're going to be associated with those two channels. So here I'm just going to drop in my compressor, and now I'm going to drop in my EQ. And that's it. You just adjust your compressor and EQ settings how you want them, and those are going to both of those guitar tracks, so you only have to do it one time. One thing I didn't quite cover, and that's other guitar tracks outside of your core rhythm guitar tracks, your metal rhythm tracks here. And of course, the primary track outside of those is your lead guitar track if you're playing guitar solos, or if you have a lead guitarist in your band that's going to be recording. The process is really the same. The only thing I really change though is on my amp. And for leads, I will bump up my gain just a little bit, and I might give the mids and the bass just a little boost. Usually my mids, I'll set it up there to about 5. I go from like 3.5 to 5, and the bass, I might go from 4.5, 4.7 to 5.5. So these aren't substantial changes, it's just to give that track just a tiny little boost. And what that does, it helps it cut through the mix a little bit better. Now a lot of you lead guitar players, you also want some delay and maybe even some other effects on your leads. Me personally, I like to use delay on my leads. Here's what I recommend though. You can use a delay pedal, and I do this sometimes. I use my Boss DD7, the digital delay DD7 pedal, because I really like the way it sounds. But the problem with using a delay pedal recording your lead track with a delay pedal or any effect is after you record it, you're kind of stuck with that. So if for whatever reason that delay is just not vibing well with the rest of the mix, you're kind of screwed. You just got to go back and re-record that track. And if you're like me, sometimes you'll pull off solos that you're like, man, I'm not sure if I can play that again. So don't hose yourself. Record your lead track with no effects, no hardware effects. And once you record that lead track, just pull in a delay plugin from your DAW and then use that. And that way you can adjust it to how you want it. And you don't necessarily have to take that advice, to be honest with you. I mean, like, sometimes I just like the sound of that delay pedal better than some of the plug-in delays that I have. So hey, if you want to take the chance, take the chance. Unless you're using some crazy delay setting, it's probably going to sound okay. Guys, don't forget to check out the links in the description of this YouTube video. I am giving away a free practice guide. I've also got some links to my music. I really appreciate when you guys support me. I am an independent artist, so Any support I get from you guys, I absolutely appreciate it. And thank you for supporting this channel too, by the way. Please also make sure you give this a thumbs up. Really appreciate that. Also, make sure you're subscribed and ding the little bell. And if you have any questions about anything I went over in this video, just leave those in the comments below. I'll be happy to respond. Sometimes it might take me a day or two, but just please be patient. I will try my best to respond to everyone. And hey, read through the comments there as well. You guys might have some input and some answers to the questions that other people have in the comments of this video. Guys, thank you once again for watching this video. Until the next video, as always, keep it metal.